Okay, so the first beat that I want to make is like a sort of typical house beat, which could then be taken in many different directions. We could go industrial or, whatever. There's all sorts of directions you could go, but let's just concentrate on a sort of typical house beat and just see how that progresses. So, of course, first of all, I've got my kick. A little bit slow at the moment, so I'm just going to change the tempo. So around 125 will be fine. So I've got my normal 4 to the floor kick. And of course, usually the next element that you're going to add in is a clap. So let's just drag our clap on. And as we've discussed, the clap invariably always sits on beats 2 and 4. Nice and cheesy. Awesome. So once we got our clap in place, we can add in our other basic element, our hat. Let's add in our open hat. As you can see, I've already picked all the samples that I need for this particular example. There's not really much point in you sitting there watching me actually go through and picking samples. It doesn't really help anything. It's just so you know. Okay, so of course we got now our hat. So at the moment we've got a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Oh yeah. Okay, so this is where a lot of people start to shy away from going much further with their drum programming, and so a lot of people turn to loops or just keep their drums very simple, like as they are now. And there's actually nothing wrong with either of those, leaving the drums very simple. It might be that that's what your track requires. If you've got a load of other stuff going on, a lot of other rhythmic stuff like arpeggiators and things, you may not want a complex drum beat. And it's fine using loops as well. Totally nothing wrong with that at all. But it does mean that you have less sort of creative control. And taking the drums a little bit further to, make interesting patterns yourself really isn't actually that difficult. So we'll go through and sort of show you how. So first of all, we've got these 3 elements. The kick is not going to change. That is going to be the same every single beat. The clap there is, I'm not going to change the position of that unless I was syncopating like later on, trying to make some kind of fill out of it. But we can sort of start changing that up a bit, and we can start messing around with the hat. So let's just play around. Now, at the moment, I've got this on a swing grid, as you might be able to tell there. I don't know if the lines are a little bit too faint for you. But I've got it set up on about a 50% swing, 52% swing. So what I wanted to do is I'm just going to drag this hat about. Now, one of the things that I don't want to do is have an exact repetition of my hat, or at least of the start of the hat. So I want to employ a technique known as ghosting. And ghosting on a real drum kit would be where the drummer just hits the snare in a sort of slightly different place and at a different force to get a different sound out of the snare. It's still the same snare, but it sounds different because he's hitting in a different place and a different force. So we can sort of mimic that in electronic dance music, even using the very same sample. So what I'll actually do is I'm just going to handle in Cubase's little function where I can hold Control and Alt at the same time, and I get this little double arrow with the dot in the middle. And it means I can move the waveform within the actual bounding audio box. So what I'm going to do to create a ghost hat in this case is actually just shift it from where it's, I don't want that initial hit. I want to just shift that along just a little bit so we're not getting the full whack of the initial hat. Let me just show you what that sounds like in comparison to a full hit. So if we just play that. So you can hear it's just a slightly sort of gentler kind of hit on the hat. Okay, so that's fine. So let's just take it a little bit further and funk it up a bit more. So let's take the clap, for example, and stick that. Let's go to like an odd 16th. And of course, you can notice there, you can see the swing. That would be right there, would be the normal dead on 16th, but we've got it on swing, so it's slightly offset. Now, of course, it sounds a bit weird being full volume like that, so I'm just going to actually shorten this just so we get a bit of a different sound out of it. And again, I'm going to use that ghosting technique to not have the full impact of the clap playing right there, and just give that a little envelope tweak just to make sure it's not clipping. And I'm going to turn that down in volume as well. And we can copy that further along as well. Let's have that on the other 16th there. So already we've got, just from making a couple of little tweaks there, we've already got a sort of different sounding beat. We've managed to funk it up a bit and add some extra depth to the rhythm. So as I was talking about earlier, we had auxiliary percussion. Now these extra little bits that I put in here, the sort of repeats of the clap and the hat and everything, they're kind of more considered auxiliary percussion. So I'm just going to mute them out for now. And we're going to concentrate on sticking in a ride element. So we're going to gone back to the basic beat, just a kick, clap and hat. And we're going to add in a ride element. So let's use some closed hats. So what I've got here is two different hats that sound kind of similar. They have similar sort of tonal qualities. Let me just play them for you. So if I just copy that across, so we've got a normal sort of 16th pattern going on there. So that's falling on every single 16th. And let's just play that over the top. So of course we could stop there. That could be enough just to add in some extra rhythm over the top. Let's just drag those up so they're all on one track. Just shorten that slightly. Now, when you have a repetitive pattern like this, when something's falling on every single 16th, things can start to sound a little bit monotonous, especially if it's played over like 4 or 5 bars. It starts to sound a bit inhuman. It's a bit too samey. There's no sort of real life to it. So what we want to do is add a bit of humanization, or what we call humanization, which means, if it's being played live, then not every single hit would be exactly the same level of volume. They'd all be just very slightly different. So what can we do to change that? So I could go along and change the volume of each individual hat hit we've got here for the whole bar. And that's fine, you can do that, no problem with it whatsoever, but it gets a little bit time consuming and you're not really sure what results you're going to get until you've gone along, changed all of the volume levels and then played it back. And you might happen to get good results doing that, but a simpler way to do it is to delete most of them and only have 2 beats. And just humanize these 2 beats. So of course I've already just humanized some of them, so that sounds all right. And I can make whatever changes I like. And then once I've got the 2 beats sorted, I can just copy them across. Just turn off the hats, makes it a bit easier to hear. And then on my second repetition, so my beats 3 and 4, I can then of course add in just a little bit more variation if I want that to be different from the first 2 beats. Just to give it a bit of extra movement. And suddenly I've got a much more natural sounding sort of hat shaker loop going on. So of course that's just playing on every single 16th of the beat. And even with the humanization, it can perhaps start to sound a little monotonous. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start chuck back in our extra hat that we put in our 2 claps. And it can almost start to sound even a bit messy just having that extra hat playing on every single 16th. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But what we can do is we can start sort of deleting some of these hats where they're not particularly needed. Now, obviously this being a sort of closed hat, or sort of digitally kind of closed hat, it doesn't need to be playing at the same time as the open hat, or it doesn't particularly need to be playing at the same time. So I can go through and just delete the hats that are falling wherever my open hats are. I'll play that. Pretty much like this is now, the hat is now sort of filling in the gaps in between the other elements. I could even delete them there as well, where they line up with the extra clap repeats, the ghost claps. And all of those things combined, so our extra little bits of hat and clap, they all sort of combine to make a ride element. And suddenly you've got a sort of much more interesting groove than if you literally just have a straight 16th pattern of hats and no extra bits in there made up of the open hats and the claps. But of course, we can take this much further. So that might do for a main part of a rhythm, but maybe we want a little bit more sort of high-end energy in there. So we can do very simple things like add in a ride as well. I'm just going to add this to every quarter beat. So it's just emphasizing the actual kick. And of course, just to make that a bit more interesting, we can start playing around with the velocities. And we can bring in elements like this when, in different parts of our track, which we'll sort of talk about a bit later. But for now, I'm kind of going through making this house beat. I'm making different elements. I may not even end up using them all, but I want to make all of these elements, get them to fit right, and then I might choose to use, the different parts in different parts of the track. I may not want to use them all at the same time. Okay, so let's just get rid of that for a sec, and let's add in a shaker loop. Now again, I'm just adding another sort of ride element here, so it's nothing particularly special. Again, I've picked two shaker samples, which are very similar in timbre. And they sort of play quite nicely off each other, so I'll just copy that across on every 16th. So again, if I'm transitioning in my track, maybe I have this playing. And then I may want to sort of take down the energy a little bit in the track and just have like the shaker playing with no hat and without the extra clap elements. And there we go, we just got another element that I can use. Now I'm not particularly sure I want to change the velocities of the shaker. Of course I can, and I'll do it in exactly the same way as I did with the hat. Delete the second lot, so I've only got 2 beats, and then just play around with these velocities. Give it a bit more of a human feel. See what it sounds like. Sounds fine, and then just double that up again. Okay, so that's fine. Now let's just keep those muted and let's have a look. Instead of the ride element, let's have a look at the auxiliary sort of percussion. Now right there, of course, is quite a sort of typical kind of house beat. But let's sort of make this a bit funkier. Let's sort of make it even maybe a bit more tribal sounding. So what I'm doing here is just dragging these 2 samples on, very sort of tribal sounding. There we go. So just adding percussion to the odd 16th. Now, as I've said, with auxiliary percussion, we can use it as a counterpoint to the actual beat. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can, funk it up like I've done here. So I've used odd 16ths and off beats instead of actually falling directly on the beat. Or, of course, we could actually use that to emphasize the main beats. So something like this. And you get a very, very different feel instantly just by sort of either emphasizing the main 4/4 beat or by using it as a counterpoint, which I must say I definitely prefer, especially in this situation. So then we can start playing around with these sounds. So I can reverse these. Sorry, you can't see this menu, but I'm just about to reverse the sample. Okay, so let's break that down. So what have we achieved there? We've taken our main beat, we've added what are known as ride elements, and always remember that, to make them sound nice, ride elements particularly need to be humanized. They need to have little variations in volume just to make them feel more natural, as with the hat and also with the shaker. Very subtle, but it really makes a big difference when it's playing in the track. And of course, then we've got our auxiliary percussion. Now I've used the hat and the clap to make some auxiliary percussion. Plus, we've added a few extra little percussive hits. And really, how long has that taken me? It's like 15 minutes or something just to make a house beat, and I've now got a few different elements that I can use in different parts of the track, and I've got myself a pretty decent house beat. Now, as I mentioned, of course, syncopation can be used later on, to make little fills. I can sort of move the claps about, exchange it with a hat, so playing with their positioning, or even literally just completely removing them. And you're just going to get like a mini sort of fill. So syncopation can be added very, very easily at any point that you want. Polyrhythm doesn't really come into this particular sort of track. I don't really want to create a dissonant sort of sound where you got two different rhythms playing over the top of each other. In a normal house track, that's not what I'm trying to achieve. This is a kind of house beat that I'd have a nice bass line, maybe an arpeggiator, a vocal, that sort of thing over the top of. So creating something that draws the attention to the beat isn't really what I want. I want to keep the attention with the main elements of the track. Okay, so let's move on to beat number 2.